In his book, Retire Inspired, Chris Hogan tells a story of meeting a client named Michael, who was desperate to get his affairs in order. Michael's favorite aunt had called him earlier and asked if he could come over and mow his 2-acre field. So he did that, and around lunchtime, he decided to take a break, went into her kitchen, was going to rustle up some lunch. He opened up the refrigerator, and all that was inside was an expired carton of milk and a bottle of ketchup. So he went through her cabinets, and all he found there were dishes and pots and pans. Finally came to her cupboard, and when he opened the cupboard, all he saw were 7 cans of dog food. And Michael said, "Chris, my aunt doesn't own a dog." We're supposed to be the richest nation in the world. But let me give you some statistics and averages, and this is not good news. 76% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. That means 3/4 of us are not planning for our future. The average American has $8,000 in credit card debt, which conservatively means they're throwing away $1,400 a year by paying interest. The average millennial is in debt to $29,000. Most of it is through student loans. And the average American spends $1.25 for every $1 they make. How are we doing as a nation? By the end of this Mass, we will have increased our national debt by $100 million. What about the 24% that are doing well, maybe even being wealthy? The question and challenge for them is, are they honoring God with that wealth? I read of a rapper who went to a club in Atlanta and did the raining money thing and spent $600,000 in one night. Let's go to the other extreme. How about the TV preacher in Texas living in a $12 million mansion? Or the other TV preacher in Atlanta that is trying to get his flock to buy him yet another private jet. I remind you, Jesus had to borrow a donkey to enter Jerusalem. If you're part of that 24%, and you're praying the Lord's Prayer every day as you should, that the kingdom would come, the question is, what are you doing with your resources to make sure that happens? These challenges about money are just not problems for America. Challenges about money is a human problem. In fact, it's a sin problem. Jesus said, "It is the love of money that's the root of all kinds of evil." And so today we hear Jesus address this problem and tell us what to do about it. So he gives us this parable. This parable of an unfaithful steward. I don't really like this translation, manager. An unfaithful steward who's about to be fired. And so he goes around and cuts a deal with everybody that owes his master money, and therefore continues to rip off his master, so that he will have a secure future with his new friends. And then what is even more shocking about this parable is he gets commended for doing this. This is a really weird parable for Jesus to give us to learn what to do about money. But this is where we got to go to the principles of biblical interpretation. As a general rule, a parable is not like an extended metaphor where you pick it apart like there's some kind of code in there. Generally, a parable makes one point, and that's the whole point of the parable, to make one point. And I believe the point of this parable that instructs us so well is this line. The master commended the dishonest steward for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. Jesus is telling his disciples that they must learn to be shrewd with money. St. Augustine put it a little more eloquently than that. He said, Jesus is recommending to the disciples the steward's foresight, prudence, and ingenuity. Well, why would Jesus want his disciples to be shrewd about money? Because the truth is, money is a snake, and you better learn which end to pick it up with, or you're going to get bit. Notice he doesn't just call it mammon. He calls it unrighteous mammon. Well, why is it unrighteous? Because, again, the love of it is the root of all kinds of evil. It's unrighteous because sometimes money is gained through the detriment of others, as we just heard from the prophet Amos. It's unrighteous sometimes because the motives of people for getting it are unrighteous. They seek it for selfish purposes or falsely believe that it's going to bring them security. I had a relative who had a plaque on her refrigerator. It said, "You can never be too rich or too thin." Sadly, that was her creed, not the Nicene Creed. That was her creed, and she lived into her creed. She was very wealthy, and she was very attractive. I was with her on the day of her death, and it was one of the worst deaths I've ever witnessed. Disease had taken away her attractiveness, and she passed screaming in terror. Her money was doing her absolutely no good at that moment. And that's why when Jesus speaks of money, he says not if it fails, but when it fails. Mammon is unrighteous because it has a corrupting influence on people if we let it, like the ring did with Gollum. So we have to learn which end of the snake to pick up. And Jesus shows us how. He does this by telling us first, "I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous mammon." Now, when Jesus begins a line, "I tell you," that's like being on a ship hearing, "Now hear this," right? I'm not whistling Dixie. This is important. Listen to me. And then he goes on to say we should make friends with our money. That hardly even sounds Christian, does it? I mean, we don't want people to love us for our money. We want them to love us for who we are. But I think what he's telling us to do here becomes a little bit more clear when we finish the line. So that when it, meaning unrighteous mammon, fails, they may receive you into the eternal habitations. Thank you, Ray. That cleared things up absolutely perfectly for me. I was flummoxed with this text and wrestled with it until I think I got it when finally I realized within the same chapter, the very next story Jesus tells is the story of Lazarus and the rich man. You remember that story? The rich man every day sumptuously eats a feast while Lazarus is sitting outside the gate covered in sores. And the text says Lazarus would have gladly eaten anything that fell off the rich man's table, but he didn't get that. They die. Lazarus goes to heaven, or what the text calls the bosom of Abraham, and the rich man goes to Hades. The point is, if the rich man had used his resources to care for Lazarus, Lazarus would have been there to greet the rich man when he entered into heaven. But the rich man didn't, so he didn't. I was relieved then to come across some of the church fathers who also interpreted this call to make friends with unrighteous mammon as a call to care for the poor. The challenge, however, is that there's just so many charities, there's so many needs, there's so many people out there hurting, it's difficult to know where to begin. And then you add on to that the number of scams that are out there that you think they need it, but they really don't. What to do? One suggestion is take a lesson from the Good Samaritan and minister to whoever's right in front of you. Don't walk around them. Don't ignore them. Minister to whatever's right in front of you. It's one of the major reasons we have Food for the Poor come here every year and have speakers, or we collect money for Food for the Poor every year, but have speakers about every other year, because they're feeding the poorest of the poor in our hemisphere. I know for a fact, I know absolutely, I've been conned over the years, thinking I was helping someone and it was a ruse. I also know that I've thrown good money after bad trying to help a parishioner only to have them turn on me. So I understand the hesitation to help. But I'm also comforted by the words of St. Augustine, who said, when you give alms to all different types of people, then you will reach a few who deserve it. Evidently, St. Augustine had been conned too. But he was okay with that because he was fulfilling Christ's command. And what's really critical to understand here is the call for us to care for the poor is not just about the poor. This call to learn generosity is because that way we become more like God, who causes the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. As we learn generosity, we become more and more conformed to the image of Christ. The second thing that he says about money that helps us to be shrewd servants is when he gives us this perspective. If you then have not been faithful in unrighteous mammon, who will entrust you with true riches? Or to put it in a positive way, if you're going to be faithful with unrighteous mammon, you will be entrusted with true riches. Now, a couple things jump out at me at this verse. One is that notice that Jesus contrasts mammon, wealth, with true riches. Why? Because from the perspective of the kingdom of God, mammon is just monopoly money. It's not real. It's not really riches. It's just monopoly money. And this season for all of us is a test. How are you going to deal with your monopoly money? And if you do okay with your monopoly money, I'll trust you with some true riches. But you blow it with the monopoly money and no. I love how Beth puts it sometimes when I'll get upset over the cost of something. She says, what the heck? They're only dead presidents, right? I mean, that's all they are. We become more shrewd when we realize that mammon is not true riches, but it's a vehicle to make us truly rich. If God can trust us to use this monopoly money properly in this life, then he will grant us true riches in the life to come. What are they? Eye hath not seen, ear hath not heard. But surely part of that is that we will rule and reign with Christ in the new heaven and new earth. And that's worth swapping your monopoly money for. Another thing that confronts me about these words of Jesus is that stewardship is not an option. Right? The only option is, am I going to be a faithful steward or am I going to be an unfaithful steward? Those are my only two choices. And I have to be honest with you, confess, I was a hypocrite in this area for way too long. I knew verses like this were in the Bible. I just ignored them. I paid my tithe. I always paid my bills. But money was an irritant to me. I didn't really care about it. I would have chosen a different job if I wanted it. I didn't think of myself as a steward. Then when we got married, to my benefit, Beth was better at money than I was, so I'd just give her my paycheck and put my head in the sand, which put a really unfair amount of pressure on her, because for most of that time we were in that 74% living paycheck to paycheck. And when we looked at our future, we could see some modest pensions, but we frankly really had no idea how we were going to retire, and that was such a difficult topic we just didn't talk about. It wasn't until I went through Financial Peace University that I had to face the fact that I was an unfaithful steward. And we began working together, and we worked hard. And we have become more and more faithful with all that God has given us. We're not doing it perfectly, but I don't feel like a hypocrite anymore. And we've discovered that one of the joys of living in the scripture that says, owe no man anything but love, is that resources then become available so that we can give more to the work of the kingdom. We've added a number of charities doing God's work beyond our tithe to this church. One of the most interesting ministries I support is a group out of California. They're a bunch of veterans who go around the world and perform military-type strikes to break up child sex rings and to free children. Probably busting a few heads when they do it, but that's okay. Jesus is so right. There is so much greater joy in giving than there is receiving. Now, third perspective Jesus gives us to be more shrewd about unrighteous mammon is at the end of the gospel said, you can't serve two masters. You cannot serve both God and man. But how do we really know who it is we're serving? Because we got to deal with money, and hopefully we're dealing with God. How do we know? It shows up through our life priorities. God says, honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. But if I ignore that commandment and pursue the almighty dollar on Sunday, then who am I really serving? If I ignore God's call to care for the widow and the orphan so I can store up riches for myself, I'm showing who I truly serve. If I'm so enslaved to debt that I can't answer the call of God, I'm showing who I truly serve. A couple of weeks ago, I had lunch with Pastor Ronnie. I'd never really heard his story about going to Zimbabwe. He taught the Bible there for a number of years. What had happened was years ago, this apostle-type figure from Africa who was overseeing thousands of Christians came to America to try to find teachers for his Bible school. And Ronnie just knew it was supposed to be. So Ronnie went home and told his wife, Margaret, about meeting this guy. And Margaret said, Ronnie, I've seen that look in your eye before. And through a couple of very clear signs, they knew they were supposed to go to Zimbabwe, even though they had a couple of young children in tow. They sold everything they had. They took the essentials there and were there for years. It was a great experience for them, and to this day they have connections in Zimbabwe and have influence. Now, if Pastor Ronnie had loved money more than God, he wouldn't have wanted to go to Zimbabwe. And if Pastor Ronnie had been enslaved by debt, he would have been able to go to Zimbabwe, no matter how much he wanted. Our life priorities tell us who we truly serve. If I could boil this whole teaching down from Jesus and be as blunt as I can be, we are confronted with two options, and not choosing is not one of those options. We are confronted with two options. We will either love God and use money, or we will use God and love money. A shrewd steward knows that the eternal destiny of his soul depends on that choice. So choose wisely, beloved. Choose wisely. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.